so you'll have to survive a few moments now without subtitles. I've lived in Europe for 14 years, but I was a child in the great state of Maine. And my first full-time job was as second mate aboard the sailing ship Figaro 4, which docked in that harbor next to the famed three-masted schooner Victory Chimes. But that's not the reason I'm here today. The reason I'm here today is this article, which appeared in the June 14th edition of SME. And from the headline, I gather that what is interesting about my story is the part where I left a respectable, well-paid job as a US diplomat and decided to live in poverty in Bratislava as the owner of a toy store. A lot of people seem to think that's a strange decision, and maybe you'd like to know why I did it. So would my mother. The problem is, my reason for doing it is so mundane that I think you won't believe it. In fact, I barely believe it myself. The truth is, I flipped a coin. When I was invited to speak here today, I knew that what I would want to talk to you about was play, because I'm in the play business. And let's be realistic, my task now is to say something interesting and relevant to you. But deep down, what I really hope is that one or more of you might share a link to a video of this presentation later on, and I'll sell a few more toys. So I spent most of my summer pondering what it means to play, and reading countless scientific studies and articles. And I will eventually share with you some of my thoughts, but I want to give away the conclusion right now. My conclusion is that sometimes letting a coin make a decision for you is going to be a more surefire way for you to play than anything you could buy from me in my store. The first life decision I consciously remember making on the basis of a coin toss was in 1999. I was 24 years old, and I asked a coin if I should leave my home in Maine and go to some strange country called Slovakia to work as a Peace Corps volunteer for 2 years. Well, 4 years later, I was quite certain I wanted to leave Slovakia, but I was also quite certain that I didn't want to go home to George W. Bush's America. So I let a coin decide that I would pursue a master's degree in international law in the Netherlands instead of a master's in public policy in Germany. And 2 years after that, a different coin, finally on the euro, made the decision for me that I would accept an offer to be the political military officer at the US Embassy in Bratislava, working for George W. Bush, instead of going to India with an old friend to set up a textile business. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that few, if any of you, believe that making decisions is really as simple as a coin toss. And good for you, because of course it isn't. But the spirit in the approach is similar to the spirit of play. And that is now finally what I'm going to talk about. Except that play turns out to be a very difficult thing to talk about. We all probably played as children, probably. Probably many of us still do play. That's supposed to be a picture of me when I was 4 years old playing, but it isn't. Which is throwing me off for a second, so forgive me my discomfort. One of the greatest things for me about working in a toy store is I get to see children playing every day. And one thing that has become very clear to me as I watch children play is that the dictionary definition of play, which is engaging in an act for amusement, really doesn't do justice to what we see when children play, to the moments of inspiration that they encounter, to the growth and satisfaction of curiosity. Play is a noun, and like tossing coins, play is defined by randomness and a willingness to set aside your experience in favor of chance. We also have the verb to play, and we use that verb in conjunction with a lot of very organized activities. We play music, we play sports. But I think intuitively everybody recognizes those activities are different from the play that a child engages in. In psychology, they talk about two different kinds of play: organized play and free play. Organized play is play that is set up by somebody who has motivations that are separate from the play. For instance, a parent, a teacher, or maybe an employer. What psychologists call free play, I would call real play, and it's distinguishable in 3 ways. First and foremost, free play is voluntary. Nobody can force you to play. Secondly, free play is intrinsically motivating. That means that it's pleasurable for its own sake, and it doesn't depend on rewards or goals that are imposed by the outside, again, for instance, by a parent or a teacher or an employer. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, free play is distinct from other activities by its make-believe quality. When you play, you can be a princess, or an astronaut, or a molecule, or molecular food. Play is magic because none of the rules from outside of the play have to apply. The foremost expert on play, according to the interwebs, is a psychologist based in Texas named Stuart Brown. Stuart Brown has studied play extensively for over 5 decades now. He compares play to oxygen. He says it's something that's invisible, essential, all around us, and yet we mostly don't notice it or don't appreciate it until it's missing. Stuart Brown's first day as a professor in 1966 was, coincidentally, the same day that Charles Whitman climbed to the top of the University of Texas Tower and shot 46 people. Like most mass murderers, this 25-year-old engineering student was going to be described later on by his friends as the last person anybody expected to go on a killing spree. But Stuart Brown was to discover that, in fact, that's not true. Charles Whitman did share something in common with 26 other Texans convicted of murder and sentenced to death row. Charles Whitman was not allowed to play as a child. I encourage you to watch Stuart Brown's TED Talk on play. He makes a very compelling case that a lack of unstructured, imaginative, free play time in childhood is correlated with an unhappy and poorly functional adulthood. And he also makes a pretty compelling case that not being allowed to play as a child is, for residents of Texas, a good predicting factor for a future on death row. I appreciate Stuart Brown's research, mostly because his 50 years of, again, meticulously accumulated data and play studies confirm something that I see every day in my toy store. And that is that for most children, play is their first experience learning to accommodate the wants and needs of other people. Play is an accessible remedy for children's curiosity, and it's available to them exactly at their youngest and most curious stage of life. And, I believe, play is also good for adults. Play can teach us to be better citizens. Play can teach us to live well together. Ideally, the capacity to compromise in a make-believe world where no other rules apply should translate into the real world and express itself as empathy. Empathy is the capacity to accept that your friends, your relatives, your colleagues, and even perfect strangers who experience the same reality differently than you do are not necessarily wrong. I am not a religious man, but I do like magic. And I like the idea of play as magic. And I like the idea of play as magic so much that honestly I was a little disappointed when, while I was preparing this presentation, my sister, a student of psychology, sent me a very dense scientific article about the latest findings in neuroscience. But it turns out that they have now proven that our brains are the most active and the most capable of reaching original creative moments exactly when they're not engaged in organized activities. That is to say, for instance, when you're at play. So it seems that science is on the cusp of defining for us on an electrochemical level why we should play. But do we really want to know? Because magic is magic only when we don't know what's really going on. And I think it's one of the greatest attributes of play that it prepares us to live in a world where we don't know things. I apologize, but I knew I was going to have to do this, so I broke the rules and brought this with me. Yes, and yet, as we learn more and more about the value of free play, marketers and people with good intentions are trying to force us into more and more organized play activities. And you can see this both in the growth and the demand for educational toys and in the growth and the popularity of programs by employers like Google, who allow their employees to play at work in the hopes of encouraging productivity. And because parents are willing to pay a premium for quality educational toys, I of course offer a wide variety of them, all of which I assure you are enjoyable, educational, and reasonably priced. But I sometimes wonder if parents who put too much emphasis on educational toys aren't being misled into believing that any given toy is something that's required for their child's education and development. Because, like adults, children only have so much time to play. And too much emphasis on an educational toy, or too much structure or instruction from a parent or a teacher, necessarily trims the space available for the intangible, undefinable lessons that a child can get from whatever world her imagination takes her to. The slogan of my toy store is, "You can play with everything." That's the slide you were supposed to see earlier. I was a cute kid. The slogan of my toy store is, "You can play with everything." And predictably, and by design, I think most of my customers understand that to me when they come in the store, that they can take anything off the shelf and open the box and pull out the toy and experiment with it before they decide, hopefully, what they will buy. And for the most part, that's true. For the most part, they can. But in fact, what I really wish people would think is not that they can play with everything, but that they can play with anything. And if it weren't for my desire one day to make a profit from my toy store, when a customer asked me if I could recommend a good toy for a 3-year-old, I would suggest a cardboard box, maybe some sticks or some mud. Because building a dam in a small stream, or testing a homemade slingshot on your sibling, or preparing a nice mud pie for your mother, these things are fun, clearly, but they're more than fun. For children, they're a first experience in hand-eye coordination, critical thinking, and basic problem solving. I'm very sorry. Right. Luckily for my business, no matter how beautifully you wrap a box full of sticks and rocks and mud, it's not going to be accepted as a birthday present by most people, by most children, with a smile. And of course, play should not be idealized. This is where you should be seeing the picture of the bully. Despite its many advantages, there is clearly a dark side to play, and there are certainly times and places where play is inappropriate. The dark side of play is typified by the playground bully you saw earlier, or else by the humiliating, brutal of children and later adults into classes and cliques. And I also want to say that my emphasis today on free play is not to diminish the value of organized play. Both organized play and free play clearly have their place. Both of them can help us to reach a good level of education and a good level of humanity. But almost by definition, organized play is going to find you, because somebody is going to organize it. You will have fun, but it's somebody else who's going to meet their goal. Free play takes a little bit more work. And necessarily, it becomes harder and harder as you get older. This is the tricycle I rode on when I was 3. Experiencing life year after year is necessarily going to lead to fewer mysteries for you to solve and fewer curiosities for you to satisfy. And inevitably, living as long as you've lived, you're going to have accepted, wittingly or unwittingly, some social norms, which will be harder and harder for you to set aside, even in a make-believe world. But one would hope that, having reached adulthood, as you all have, you have also achieved the maturity that you need to recognize which rules can be set aside and when. Playing in the mud is messy. Talking to strangers is risky. But life is also messy and risky. So let me suggest 3 things you might do. Talk to strangers, play with food, and let a child lead the way from time to time. They say that playfulness is infectious, and I believe that's true. But there's no reason you should limit yourself to infecting your friends. Go somewhere you've never been, talk to someone you've never met, and try to engage them in some fun. For me, one of the greatest things about working in a toy store is that every day I get to play with strangers of all ages from all over the world. Now, if you don't happen to own a toy store or a bar, then you might have a lack of strangers in your life that you can play with. And that's where I think the food can come in, because in my experience, an excellent way to bring out any playful personalities in a room is to take whatever free supplies are on a restaurant table and begin building castles and statues and airplanes. And usually you'll attract the attention of the child sitting at the table next door. And there's nothing better than playing with a stranger's child, provided you observe the basic social norms of such a thing. And if you do have children in your life, then by all means, teach them to live life with a passion. But occasionally, let them teach you, because life is an adventure, and on some adventures, there's no better guide than a complete amateur, which a child will be. And finally, as I promised at the beginning, let me suggest that you might flip a coin. If deciding to quit your career and open a toy store is a step too far, a decision that you're not willing to leave to a coin, you might at least set aside a few hours on a sunny afternoon and take a coin and go for a walk. And at every intersection, let the coin decide which direction you're going to turn. The random quality of the resulting journey, I guarantee you, will present a curiosity that you haven't encountered before. And so long as you don't drop the coin, it'll be free. But even if you do drop the coin, it'll still be free play. Thank you.